one of you be willing to share exact or in what ways you do make use of those principles at boot camp, to help address these mentalistic concerns that might show up?
Sure. Oh yeah. I mean, that's kind of the whole, for me at least, that's again, kind of the whole point of the entire experience is going over these functional analyses and of understanding how complex verbal behavior works, especially rule governed behavior, and understand how verbal behavior about private events works and how that interacts with other overt behaviors that matter socially. So I mean, to me, again, the whole thing is hundreds, maybe thousands of exemplars of verbal behavior that works better, verbal behavior that works less well, that's more rigid. And what we do, we bring people on the stage, we role play, and we practice, and we see what works and doesn't work. And we model acceptance by feeling uncomfortable in the moment. But what's really cool is, as kind of anxiety provoking as that can be for some folks, the amount of positive reinforcement that spontaneously comes from the audience when they see other behavior analysts taking a risk, and when they see other behavior analysts showing that they really care and that they're willing to try, is pretty incredible.
One of the things I think that you can hold the trainers to account is that if you ever, don't do it compulsively because it's a workshop to run, but if you ever think that it doesn't make sense behavior, that's a time for a question. And there's ample opportunity to walk through it. We understand that. We're kind of walk that through. And it is true that relational operants are not in everybody's background to the point where you're really fluid with it. But we literally have hundreds of studies now, and it's on the task list, that derived relational responding and, equivalence-based responding and so forth are things that we need to deal with. Well, once you open that door, you begin to see how it's not enough to simply put things on extinction. You probably wouldn't do that with a child if there was a behavioral excess. You'd probably also try to train more effective behavior, wouldn't you? And there's not many people who are simply going to do one without the other. Well, the problem is that these relational operants, as Tom was pointing to, can move in dark ways, in ways that are repertoire narrowing and that don't actually move the client or yourself or the parent forward. Even if you see that, it's not enough just to not go there. You have to apply an alternative. So what are you going to do with things we call thoughts, with things we call feelings? Those things are not mental events. They're behavioral events. It's true, some of them are private events. But, that equation of private equals mental was exactly what Skinner went after. He spent much of his career trying to take that thing down. And so, I think if we stay with the Skinnerian tradition of functional analysis and we stay with our principles of, as we detect how these relational operants work, provide people with the alternatives that allow them to establish the new behaviors that allow them to accomplish their ends. That's just right off the task list.
Thank you. And what about with regards to, let's say I'm a BCBA who has attended boot camp and I'm excited to kind of take what I've learned and begin applying it into my practice. What would I need to be aware of in terms of ABA's scope of practice and how doing ACT might fit in or not fit in there?
Well, you've come to the right place. The four of us, along with Emily Sandoz, are currently writing a paper on exactly this.
Nice.
And of course, it's not a simple answer, but and I know Evelyn has some very useful stuff to say on this too. But the most important thing is after you learn sort of a new repertoire, a new practitioner repertoire, from 4 days of training, it doesn't necessarily mean you just go do it willy-nilly with no mentorship or supervision. Like any other clinical skills that you develop, you need behavioral skills training, you need modeling and role play and rehearsal and feedback. And then you need some supervision and mentorship from someone who is already an expert in that. And that doesn't matter whether it's feeding disorders or severe problem behavior, functional analysis of severe behavior, or whether it's integrating ACT, functional analyses and procedures into your everyday ABA practice. So I think you are able to do some stuff immediately, some of the smaller tweaks right away after boot camp. But for sure, like anything else we do, we need to be competent. and we need to make sure that we get proper supervision and mentorship.
Thank you. And Evelyn, would you like to add to that?
I totally agree with Jonathan in that getting mentorship and supervision is key before you think that you can run out and apply a bunch of stuff you learned in 4 days. Although I do agree with Jonathan that there's going to be things that you learn at bootcamp that you can take to your practice. I guess a few different things come to my mind in terms of figuring out scope, and one is always asking. I'm always asking myself, is this ABA? Is what I'm doing right now ABA? And I think about the 7 dimensions. I think about this, and referring to the task list, what ABA is, and kind of what my role, like how I'm enhancing my role as a behavior analyst using this stuff. I'm not like dramatically changing what I'm doing day to day. I'm just doing it better. I'm having the similar conversations that I would have had with parents, but I'm managing those better. I'm responding more effectively. Same with the kids and staff that I work with. So I guess those are some kind of pointers in terms of thinking about scope, as well as competency, which is a whole different thing, other additional thing. Referring to my code of ethics as well, and as would be another tool.
Well, one thing that immediately can be done that's quite safe, and I've seen this over and over again, is if people bring some of their coworkers or a significant portion of their staff, that immediately what start happening is people start doing things inside their staff training and their supervision meetings and the things that are going on, because it feels safe. You can try things out. This is based on the psychology of that is not abnormal. We're looking, in the sense that we're looking at relational operants that we ourselves engage in addition to the behaviors that are under a direct contingency control. And so you can easily put it into staff training, and we will cover some of that in bootcamp itself. We will cover some issues of supervision and some of the continuing education credits for that, but also the staff kind of work. Sometimes that question includes, though, really this kind of thing, can then I then go and start doing psychotherapy? And, I prefer to call it acceptance and commitment training when it's being used in a behavioral analytic context. Not that it's not therapeutic, but there's just no reason for us at this point in the development of our field to risk what we would risk by wandering out into, trying to treat syndromes of this sort or another, or looking at the DSM and all of that. Long run, I do think behavioral principles and BCBAs will expand their scope of practice in a very sensible, reasonable, careful way. But what we're doing right now is I think, focusing on the populations and the problems that you are now dealing with and empowering you to deal with that more effectively based on the evidence, and expanding it out in ways that will help you, I think, with your staff and how you organize things, and also even with yourself. And you should see more motivation, people following through more, fewer barriers. You should see more cooperation. It's just very common. And if people have sensed from the outside that there's something a little spooky about it because people get excited, it really is not because there's a chicken ritual. It is not because there's something weird going on there. It's just that when you see that principles you have help in many areas, including with the person you see in the mirror, that's really cool. Mm-hmm. And I'm old enough to remember what that felt like when people were applying direct contingency principles for the first time to the lives of their clients and at home. I mean, people were really on fire. I mean, the Walden 2 kind of side of behavior analysis is there for a reason. You felt as though you can change the world, and you can change your relationships, and you can change your family, you can change schools. And many of those things, actually, that's true. But it isn't the end. This is a continual journey, and new things arrive that we can then use. And so, the substance of the work there has reached a level where now we can tell that story in a very tight way, and at any point kind of walk through why this is behaviorally sensible, and then allow the data to decide. And if people get excited, it's not because they're irrational, it's because they see an opportunity and they can feel it right in their own behavior of the expansiveness of how things open up and you can do things. That's just cool.
Very cool.
In all of my in all of my workshops, I ask participants how many people had that experience of doing some shaping and some chaining with either with an animal or with a person, and just sensing, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. This works. And virtually everybody raises their hands. And by the end of our workshops, people have that same kind of experience with this for dealing with a different set of problems, a set of problems that don't get solved by the same kind of problem solving. They get solved with problem solving strategies. Mm-hmm. And the question of scope of practice is a vital question. It's an important question because really it gets down to our right to practice. If we step outside of our scope of practice, we stand to lose our right to practice. So one simple way, and we're going to address this deeply inside of BootCamp, but one simple way to think about it is that inside of Bear, Wolf, and Risley are some general rules to follow. We treat socially significant behavior that's observable and measurable. Those are our dependent variables. But that doesn't mean that other things don't come up along the way that we address en route to contingency management. As long as our focus remains that we come back to direct contingency management, we're staying within our scope of practice. And we layer in indirect contingency focuses so that we can bring behavior back under the control of relevant direct contingencies where that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out too that it's not about trying to change private events. You know, like the fact that we're talking about private events doesn't mean we're trying to change private events. You could change all the private events in the world, and if it didn't produce some socially meaningful overt behavior change, I think I speak for the whole ACT community in saying, like, who cares then? That's not the deal. That's not what we're about. And so it turns out talking about private events isn't necessarily a private event. I mean, you could think about your private events if you want to, but when you talk to your behavior analyst about private events, that's a public behavior. That's an overt verbal behavior. Mm-hmm. And so that is absolute. And if it's an overt verbal behavior that actually matters in a socially important way, connecting to some other overt behavior like implementing extinction with your kid, or showing up to work on a consistent basis, or giving the parent feedback if it's the behavior analyst themselves whose behavior is changing. If it connects to socially overt behavior, then all the more so. I mean, that's the goal. So.
You know, sometimes these concerns come up because ACT has a set of middle-level terms that don't sound behavioral. You just haven't heard them before. But the concept of middle-level terms is nothing spooky for behavior analysts. If you take something like aggression, you know, you can define what aggression is. Different people have slightly different terms for it. You can see it, you can define it, you can measure it. It doesn't mean that it's a technical term. I mean, you don't have like, here are the list of terms. There's reinforcement, there's stimulus control, and there's aggression. No, you'd never do that. No, because this is a domain that then is unpacked in terms of behavioral principles. And so if you suddenly lean out of schedule, you're going to see schedule-induced aggression. If you start dumping in aversives, you're going to see, you know, pain-elicited or aversive-elicited aggression, etc. And so it's in the same way, there is a language. Now, what does happen, I think, when behavior analysts are doing it, and frankly, I have to tell you, it makes me smile and feel much freer when it happens. If you take something like values, the term values is used in behavior analysis. We have a way of thinking about it in an ACT because of the combination of these relational operants altering and sometimes establishing events as functional consequences, you know, functioning as establishing stimuli. And we, you know, it's in our language so long ago that some people think this is like technical behavioral language of, you know, motivative and formative augmentals. You know, appliance tracking, augmenting, people use those terms sometimes without understanding. This is part of RFT. This is actually just the first wave of the same tradition you're re-entering when you come to BootCamp. I made those terms up. So I remember the history and why we did it. But now, you know, so you can talk about, you know, okay, what are the verbal establishing operations, motivative and formative, that can alter the functional consequences, in particular to establish ones that are intrinsic to the behavior itself as an ongoing pattern. Once you've got that, and you can do that, I mean, you have parents just persisting, out of the love and care for their kids, which they've connected to in a different way. You need a language for that. And so it's not that you suddenly have become mentalistic, because when you use these summative terms, which are really summaries of sets of functional analyses, you should at any point be able to stop and say, well, tell me in terms of the basic science. And here we have dozens in every area, dozens of studies that allow you to do that. Now, I'm not saying it's all finished. I'm not saying it's that all the T's have been crossed and the I's have been dotted and we've got the answer. It's not like that. It's just that you can benefit from 30 years of research, and it's there. And you can look yourself and say, does that make sense? Are there such things as verbal establishing operations? Do they work through relational operants? Do they alter how the contingencies influence behavior? And at the point at which you reach that, well, then we need some friendly or easy language. And different people need different things. But so that's true with diffusion and acceptance and attention and all these kinds of things. Some of which would sound mentalistic, but in the hands of a good ACT person, if they have behavioral background, behavioral training, are decidedly not.